In a world where the sun rises and sets, casting shadows of both light and darkness, the power to govern is a double-edged sword. Imagine a kingdom where the king's word is law, and the people live by his decree. Now, picture this king, a man who wields the power to shape the destiny of his people. He can decide who lives and who dies, who prospers and who suffers. This is not a story of a benevolent ruler, but of a man who struggles with the weight of his authority. The king, a man of middle years, sits on his throne, his eyes heavy with the burden of his decisions. He has been appointed by a higher power, one that many call divine. This divine power has assigned him the task of maintaining order, of ensuring that the laws of the land are upheld and that the people are protected. But with great power comes great responsibility, and the king often finds himself torn between what he believes is right and what he is forced to do. One day, a messenger arrives with news that a neighboring kingdom is planning an invasion. The king's heart sinks. He knows that war will bring death and destruction. But he also knows that he must protect his people. The decision to go to war is not an easy one. He remembers the words of ancient philosophers who said that no polity can be successfully established unless it first cares for the worship of God. This means that the king must not only protect his people from external threats, but also ensure that the kingdom remains faithful to its religious duties. The king recalls the stories of holy kings from the past who were praised for restoring the worship of God and maintaining the purity of their faith. He thinks of King David, who, when he ascended the throne, vowed to rid his kingdom of wickedness and protect the innocent. The king realizes that his role is not just to rule, but to be a guardian of both the spiritual and temporal well-being of his people. But the king is also a human, and he feels the pressure of his decisions. He wonders if he should long for a different form of government, one that might be less burdensome. Yet, he knows that such a wish would be foolish and dangerous. The divine order has placed him in this position, and it is his duty to obey and submit. The king's thoughts turn to the two tables of the law, the moral and religious principles that guide his rule. He remembers the words of Jeremiah, who exhorted rulers to execute judgment and righteousness, to protect the poor and the fatherless, and to do no wrong. He knows that his role is to be a defender of the innocent and a punisher of the wicked. He must not only maintain order, but also ensure that justice is served. The king's mind is also troubled by the paradox of his role. As a Christian, he is forbidden to kill, yet as a ruler, he is sometimes required to shed blood to protect his people. He finds solace in the idea that when he punishes the guilty, he is not acting out of personal vengeance, but out of obedience to God's will. He is a minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath on those who do evil. The king's decision to go to war is not taken lightly. He knows that war is a last resort, a necessary evil. When all other means of peace have failed, he remembers the words of Augustine, who said that if Christian discipline condemned all wars, the soldiers who asked for guidance would have been told to cast away their arms and withdraw from military service. But they were told to be content with their pay, which means that their service is not condemned. The king's heart is heavy as he contemplates the coming conflict. He knows that he must act with caution, not allowing his personal feelings to cloud his judgment. He must think of the greater good, of the safety and well-being of his people. He must be guided by the principles of justice and mercy, ensuring that his actions are for the benefit of all. As the king rises from his throne, he feels the weight of his decisions. He knows that the path ahead is fraught with challenges, but he is determined to fulfill his duty. The weight of power is a heavy burden, but he is ready to bear it for the sake of his people and the kingdom he loves. In the world of laws and rules, there's a lot to think about, especially when it comes to how we should live as Christians. The big question is, how do we follow God's laws while also living in a society that has its own set of rules? Let's break it down. First, we need to understand that laws are like the glue that holds a society together. They help us know what's right and wrong, and they guide us in how to treat each other fairly. Think of laws as the rules of a game. Without them, the game would be chaotic, and no one would know how to play. Now, when it comes to God's laws, we can divide them into three main parts: the moral law, the ceremonial law, and the judicial law. The moral law is like the golden rule. Treat others the way you want to be treated. This is something that applies to everyone, no matter where they live or what time they live in. It's about loving God and loving your neighbor. The ceremonial law was a set of rules that the ancient Jewish people followed to show their devotion to God. These rules were like a training ground to help them understand the deeper truths about God. But now, since Jesus has come, we don't need to follow these rules anymore. They were a way to point to Jesus, and now that he's here, we can focus on him directly. The judicial law was the set of rules that the Jewish people used to keep their society running smoothly. These rules were specific to their time and place, and they helped them live together in peace. But just because they had these rules doesn't mean every country needs to follow them exactly. Each country can make its own rules as long as those rules are fair and just. So, what does this mean for us today? It means that we should follow the laws of our country, but we should always make sure those laws are fair and just. We shouldn't blindly follow laws that are cruel or unfair. Instead, we should use our understanding of God's moral law to guide us. If a law in our country doesn't align with treating others with love and respect, we should speak up and try to change it. Now, when it comes to using the law courts, it's important to remember that it's not always wrong to go to court. Sometimes we need to protect ourselves or others from harm. For example, if someone is trying to steal from you or hurt you, it's okay to ask for help from the police or the courts. But we should never go to court out of a desire for revenge or to hurt someone else. We should always approach the legal system with a heart of love and a desire for justice. Paul, one of the early Christian leaders, talked about this a lot. He said that the government is there to help us, not to harm us. When we use the legal system, we should do it to protect the good and punish the bad, not to satisfy our own anger or desire for revenge. If we go to court, we should do it with a clear conscience and a heart that's still open to forgiveness. Christ also taught us to be patient and kind, even when others are unkind to us. He said that if someone hits you on one cheek, you should turn the other cheek. This doesn't mean we should let people walk all over us, but it does mean we should be willing to endure some wrongs without seeking revenge. We should always try to resolve conflicts in a peaceful way, but if that's not possible, it's okay to seek help from the authorities. Paul also warned against a spirit of always wanting to go to court. He said that the Corinthians were causing problems by constantly suing each other. This was making the Christian community look bad and was causing division. So while it's okay to use the legal system when necessary, we should always try to resolve things in a loving and peaceful way first. In the end, it's all about balance. We should follow the laws of our country, but we should also make sure those laws are fair and just. We should use the legal system when we need to, but we should never do it out of a desire for revenge. Instead, we should always approach the law with a heart of love and a desire for justice. In the world of ancient teachings, there's a lot to think about when it comes to how we should treat those in power, even if they don't always act the way they should. One of the key ideas is that we should respect and obey our rulers no matter what. This might seem strange, but there are some important reasons behind it. First, we're told to have a deep respect for the position of rulers, not just the person holding it. Think of it like this. Imagine you have a teacher who isn't very nice. Even though you might not like the teacher, you still have to respect the role of being a teacher because it's important for the class to function. In the same way, rulers are seen as people chosen by God to lead, and we should respect that role, even if the person isn't perfect. For example, the Bible tells us to honor the king and to fear the Lord and the king. 1 Peter 2:17, Proverbs chapter 24, verse 21. This means we should have a sincere and genuine respect for the ruler, seeing them as someone appointed by God to guide and protect the people. Paul, a key figure in the early Christian church, also said, "Be subject not only for wrath, but also for conscience' sake." Romans chapter 13, verse 5. This means we should obey rulers not just because we're afraid of punishment, but because we believe it's the right thing to do, as if we're obeying God Himself. Another important point is that we should be ready to show our obedience in different ways. This could mean following laws, paying taxes, or even taking on public duties. Paul tells us to be subject to principalities and powers, to obey magistrates, and to be ready to every good work. Titus chapter 3, verse 1. This means we should be willing to do our part to keep society running smoothly. But what about when rulers are bad or unfair? This is a tricky question, but the teachings suggest that we should still obey them up to a point. The Bible tells us that even rulers who are not good are there for a reason. For example, the prophet Jeremiah said, "I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant." Jeremiah chapter 27, verse 6. Even though Nebuchadnezzar was a tyrant, God still saw him as a ruler, and the people were told to obey him. This might seem unfair, but the idea is that God is in control, and even when rulers are bad, it's part of a bigger plan. The Bible also tells us to pray for our rulers, even if they are not kind to us. In Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 7, it says, "Seek the peace of the city whither I have caused you to be carried away captives, and pray unto the Lord for it, for in the peace thereof shall ye have peace." This means that even when things are tough, we should pray for the well-being of the city and its leaders. There's a famous story in the Bible about King Saul and David. David was chosen by God to be the next king, but Saul was still the current king and was trying to kill David. Even though Saul was being very unfair, David refused to harm him because he saw Saul as God's anointed ruler. David said, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch forth mine hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord." 1 Samuel 24:6. This teaches us that we should respect the position of rulers, even if they don't always act the way they should. It's not our job to judge or punish them. That's God's role. Our job is to do our best to be good citizens and to respect the authority that God has placed in their hands. So, even if rulers are not perfect, we should still try to be good and obedient subjects. This doesn't mean we have to agree with everything they do, but it does mean we should respect their position and do our part to keep society running smoothly. In the end, it's about trusting that God is in control and doing our best to live in a way that honors Him. In this part of the book, we talk about how to behave when the people in charge, like kings or leaders, don't do what's right. The main idea is that we should always remember our own faults first and ask God for help, rather than trying to fix things ourselves. This keeps us humble and patient. Sometimes, God uses people to help others, even if those people don't know they're doing God's work. For example, God used Moses to free the Israelites from Pharaoh, and Cyrus to free the Jews from Babylon. These helpers were chosen by God to do His will, even if they didn't realize it. There are also special people, like judges or magistrates, who are supposed to protect the people from bad leaders. If a king becomes a tyrant, these magistrates should step in. If they don't, they're not doing their job and are betraying the people they're supposed to protect. But for regular people, it's important to obey the rulers as long as what they ask doesn't go against God's commands. If a ruler asks you to do something that goes against God, you should say no. This is because God is the highest authority, and we should always listen to Him first. Daniel refused to obey the king's command to pray to him instead of God, and he didn't feel guilty about it because the king was asking him to do something wrong. On the other hand, the Israelites were criticized for following King Jeroboam when he set up false idols. They should have refused to follow him because he was leading them away from God. It can be dangerous to stand up to a ruler, as they can be very angry. But we should remember that obeying God is more important than pleasing a human ruler. As the Apostle Peter said, we must obey God rather than men. This means that if we have to choose between following God or a human ruler, we should always choose God, even if it means facing consequences. In the end, we are reminded that we belong to God and were bought at a great price by Jesus Christ. This means we shouldn't just do what anyone tells us, especially if it goes against what God wants. We should be brave and stand firm in our faith, knowing that God is always with us and will help us through any trouble. So, let's be mindful of our own faults, pray for guidance, and always remember that God is the ultimate ruler. When we do this, we can face any challenge with courage and faith,